the greatest failure of 9/11 was a failure of imagination, of anticipating the range of plausible things that could happen. The more that the world changes, the faster that it changes, the less that we can turn to our past experience for guidance. And that's when imagination becomes particularly important. How do we figure out what to do today when we don't know what tomorrow will look like? And this is a question that not only investment professionals face or organizations face or countries face, it's a question we face as individuals, each and every day.
Welcome to the Tao of Chao podcast, where we will try to find balance and provide a clearer path forward in this uncertain world.
Peter Scoblic is a co-founder and principal of Event Horizon Strategies. He's also a senior fellow with the Future Security Program at New America and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University, where he teaches foresight and forecasting, and he is an instructor at Harvard's Professional Development Program, where he teaches behavioral decision-making. He is currently writing a book for Simon & Schuster on the history of decision-making under uncertainty. Peter received his doctorate from Harvard Business School, where his research on strategic foresight won the Wise Award for Excellence. He has certificates in wargaming from the Naval War College and Military Operations Research Society, as well as a certificate in scenario planning from the Oxford Scenarios Program at Said Business School. He received his AB in Political Science with honors from Brown University. And here is Peter. Welcome to Tao of Chao.
Thank you, Philip.
I've been waiting for this for a while, and I'm excited to have you as my guest. Really want to spend some time with you to discuss a topic that you are brilliant at, the strategic foresight. As you know, I was your student earlier this year in the Global Foresight Executive Education course, and offered by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and it was really an eye-opening experience. I would love to dive into that topic. So I guess first thing first, tell us how you define strategic foresight and what is so beneficial about using this approach.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Philip. It's a real honor to be on and have the chance to speak with you at some greater length.
Thank you.
I've been thinking about strategic foresight for the last 10 years or so, and the way that I define it is the deliberative use of imagined alternative futures in order to better sense, shape, and adapt to the emerging future. And each of those words is quite carefully chosen. We try to better sense what is coming at us from the future. To the extent that we sense something that is not to our liking, we want to try to shape the future. And to the extent that we can't shape it, we need to be able to adapt to it. And then the question is really, well, how do we do that? And so I've turned to imagined alternative futures, using our imagination, our creativity to sort of cognitively envision the range of plausible futures that we might encounter. And that allows us to better prepare today.
Sounds a little bit like I wish type of thing. I know I'm making fun of it. I don't mean it, but it's like, this is what I imagine. This is what I would like it to be, or it could possibly be, or even though I may not like it, it could still be. Is that the kind of imagination you are thinking about?
There are different ways that we can think about futures. One of them is aspirational. This is the way that I would like the future to look, or this is the way the future should look, sort of a normative look at the future. But we don't have to put any sort of judgment on it. We can look at a range of futures that are good, that are bad, that are ugly. And the truth of the matter is that all futures have some elements that are good, some are bad, and some are ugly.
Okay.
We try to increase the proportion of good that we can and decrease the proportion of bad to the extent that we can. But to the extent that we don't have control, we at least want to know what's coming so that we can adapt better along the way. And the reason we turn to imagination, which is not one of these words that crops up normally in professional conversation.
Right.
You mentioned CSIS, a lot of national security folks. National security folks don't generally turn to imagination when they think about how to best protect the country or, various interests that they may have internationally. And yet, when we think about some of the greatest strategic failures that have happened throughout history. If you think, for example, about the 9/11 attacks, the 9/11 Commission report, a very thorough, lengthy, widely praised report, concluded that one of the greatest failures, if not the greatest failure of 9/11, was a failure of imagination, of anticipating the range of plausible things that could happen. And so the more that the world changes, the faster that it changes, the less that we can turn to our past experience for guidance. And that's when imagination becomes particularly important.
Wow. All that, I already have so many questions in it because I'm thinking AI, I'm thinking about machine learning, I'm thinking about things that we cannot even think about that exists. And that's really reaching that outer limits of plausibility. So in your well-received 2020 Harvard Business Review paper, and anybody listen to this can just Google it and you will find it prominently displayed. Paper titled Learning from the Future, which is wonderful, right? Learning from the future. It's almost like Back to Future. It's like, you've been there already, kind of learning from the future. You posed a question that how can we formulate strategy in the face of uncertainty? And that's what attracted me into this paper. I'm in the investment business, and the investment business is all about the future. It's like, how can I gain that X factor that I know something so that I can do something that's ahead of somebody else, have information advantage or what have you, and really thinking about on a macro basis and so on. So I was very excited about that statement. And so how do you answer this question, and what is the process to put a framework around uncertainty?
This question of how to formulate strategy under uncertainty is really what's driven me over these past years. Put a little bit differently, that's very much in sort of business school speak. Put a little bit differently, it's sort of how do we figure out what to do today when we don't know what tomorrow will look like? And this is a question that not only investment professionals face, or organizations face, or countries face. It's a question we face as individuals, each and every day. Yes. How do we choose a course of action that we think is going to get us where we want to go? And all too often, the problem is that the future looks like this undifferentiated mass of uncertainty. It's just this sort of opaque, you cannot, peer past the veil of the future. And you can wind up in this almost hopeless sense of, anything could happen. And it's neither true nor useful to say that anything could happen. There's not much you can do with that. And so what I like to say is we construct a deliberative process to examine facets of the future, to look at key uncertainties, what we think are the things that are worrying us the most, that will have the greatest impact on the future, but whose value we don't know what it will be. We don't know whether it'll be good or bad, positive or negative, high, low, what have you. And we can go through a process and say, okay, well, here are a few of the key uncertainties that are worrying me. Here's what keeps me up at night. Mm-hmm. And then say, well, let's say that things went one way on this particular uncertainty, another way on this particular uncertainty. If we combine those two things, what would that world look like? Mm-hmm. What would it look like if we assigned different values? And then we can build out scenarios of what those future worlds might look like. And then that allows us the opportunity to take a step back. We've put some boundaries on the future. We have not captured the entirety of the future. We cannot do that. But we can look at a range of plausible futures. And then we can ask ourselves, am I prepared? Is my organization prepared? Is my country prepared? Should any of those futures come to pass? And if not, what are strategies, what are robust strategies, courses of action that would obtain to any of those futures that we could take today, things we would wish we had done today if one of those futures materialized. So that gives us a start at an answer.
I'll come back to that because I think part of that discussion also is who is in the room to talk about that future.
Absolutely.
Is there groupthink in it? How diversified the participants should be? I can make a case that the more diversified, the better, because then we can expand that imagination, we can expand the universe. But on the other hand, they know nothing about what I'm thinking about. So it's within what universe should we be expanding this imagination? So those are things that folks like you who are professional in this can hopefully help us, even as we want to practice this. How do we select individuals? But who are those individuals that may make sense? So maybe I'll come back to that, because I think the uncertainty part is really important, right? So in a and you wrote this in your paper, in a VUCA or VUCA world, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. By the time when I look at all this, I just want to go back to sleep. We need a way to link, current, moves to future outcomes. And by the way, in my opinion, VUCA or VUCA is the normal world. For me, as an investment professional, we operate in a complex system, right, with no control over any economic, geopolitical, environmental, and I threw in environmental because I feel that this is something really is out of our control, and behavioral factors, which is the other thing out of our control. And any one area could blow up without any warning to any of us. So the uncertainty is constant and often manifested in a state of heightened volatility. So you stated in your writing that strategic foresight does not help us to figure out what to think about the future. It helps us figure out how to think about the future. Tell me a little bit. I'm still trying to wrap around what you said. I think it's very important. So if you can help me to understand it a little better, what you meant.
I often, engage with industries or domains that I am not necessarily an expert in. I have enough humility, maybe not enough, but enough sort of humility to recognize that I am not in a position to forecast that precisely. And at the same time, there is a way to think about it that is constructive. And the state of VUCA that you mentioned, and when confronted with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, all you want to do is pull the covers up over your head.
Yes.
When I say what I do is, help people with how to think about the future, it's to give them tools so they don't feel the need to pull the covers over their head. Because if they are empowered with tools, then it's easier to face uncertainty and its cousins more effectively. And so Herman Kahn, the famous or infamous, depending on your viewpoint, nuclear strategist who operated at the height of the Cold War, was trying to think about what a nuclear war would look like. And although the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, no one had ever fought a nuclear power with another nuclear power. And so we did not know what, say, a US-Soviet conflict would look like if it went nuclear. So it was the amount of uncertainty there was enormous. And the question was, how do you learn to deal with that? And so what Kahn said was, what we need are strange aids to thought, things that tell us how to think about really big, seemingly intractable problems. And scenarios were one of his strange aids to thought. So that's the how. And then the what, stems from using those tools in combination with domain expertise and interaction with the other people in the room that you mentioned who are maybe participating in a scenario planning exercise. And together, you can co-create the what. And the what may be only one, of a range of plausible futures. We're talking about foresight. There is, of course, also forecasting, where we put probabilities on specific future events. But scenarios fall into the realm of what practitioners call foresight, trying to scope out this range of plausible futures.
When you talk about, you just now spoke 2 words, foresight and forecast. I don't think foresight meant to be forecast, and I know you didn't say that. I'm just trying to tease it out a little bit. I think it's misunderstood. If you can explain a little bit more, because people get confused between foresight and forecast.
This is a place where English does us no great service, I'm afraid, because people tend to use the terms synonymously. And within the world of folks who practice either one or the other, they're used quite differently. So forecasting refers to the practice of putting probabilities on very clearly defined future events. So in the realm of international politics, we can think of it sort of as a geopolitical meteorology. Almost. And I mean that in a positive way. We've learned from the work of Philip Chao at Wharton and others that it is possible to find people who are better than others at putting probabilities on the future that are well calibrated, meaning things you say are 70% likely happen 70% of the time. But that makes this assumption, and forgive the use of a big word, but that makes an epistemological assumption that we can know something about the future. Often people who practice foresight, that is, people who are doing a more qualitative look, a narrative look at the range of plausible futures, not what's most probable, but what's plausible, tend to say, the number of futures is infinite. We can't conceive of all of them. And so this notion of putting probabilities on things is a little bit silly. I tend to ride both horses simultaneously, which is a little bit of a trick. But here we're talking about foresight, strategic foresight, using these narratives of alternative futures to help us scope the range of the plausible.
Interesting. So this perfectly leads into the next sort of thinking about uncertainty and risk. You can imagine how much we need to think about that in investing. So Nobel laureate, I think, is Niels Bohr, and baseball player, we all know Yogi Berra, famously said that prediction is very difficult, especially if it is about the future. And John Kenneth Galbraith, a well-respected economist, once said, there are two kinds of forecasters, those who don't know and those who don't know, they don't know. So it's like, okay, so all right. So I understand that strategic foresight is not about predicting the future, nor forecast about events, but really how do groups derive that benefit, right? You already mentioned, we're not trying to define what all the possible scenarios, that will be scenario planning, and then probabilistically, almost like all the variables and assigning numbers of it happening. That's not at all what this is.
Correct.
And so how would you help groups to do strategic foresight and try to minimize the influence of probabilistic thinking, which is we are more used to? Yeah, what's the chance of me crossing the street and get hit by a car? I mean, that kind of thinking, rather than saying, imagine how I cross the street. I could fly across the street. I don't think I can swim across this water. I can crawl across the street, all those type of possibilities. So how do you lead that kind of discussion to expand the mind to allow individuals to start getting what you are talking about under the umbrella of imagination?
Right. I mean, one thing one has to do is often caution people not to try to put probabilities on the future, or when they're coming up with a scenario, to try to come up with the most likely scenario, or if they come up with a set of them, to assign them probabilities, because that's not what we're doing with this. What we're doing is, combining factors, combining key uncertainties in ways that challenge our existing assumptions about what the future is going to look like, our expectations of what is going to happen. So we all walk around with mental models of how the world works, of the relationships between cause and effect. You mentioned complex systems. We often have sort of at least an implicit belief about how the system around us works. The problem with mental models is they do tend to operate, first of all, implicitly. We don't often say, this is why I believe X, why I believe Y, or how these things connect. The world changes rapidly around us, and our mental models have a tendency not to keep up. Yeah. We tend not to update as fast as we should in the face of new information. And some of that's just because we cling tightly to our beliefs, and some of that's because we're overwhelmed by the amount of information the world throws at us, and we succumb to what Herbert Simon, Nobel Prize-winning economist, referred to as bounded rationality. There are just limits to how much information we can incorporate. And so we have these sticky mental models. And what constructing scenarios and forcing ourselves to envision futures where two things that we thought might not go together, we just say, assume they have. Now, what does that world look like? And that will challenge our assumptions of what the world could look like, what it might look like, what is plausible. It expands our conception of the plausible using imagination. And that's enormously valuable, because if nothing else, the future is likely to surprise.
Always does.
That we can say is probable.
Yeah, we have almost we can almost say certainty. You say in your paper that uncertainty stems from our inability to compare the present to anything we haven't previously experienced. So if we've never done it, that couldn't happen, or whatever, or our frame of reference really probably is what you're talking about. When situation lacks analogies to the past, we have trouble envisioning how they will play out in the future. So in 1921, that is, Chicago economist, which you actually cited also, Frank Knight, we talk about that in investing all the time, wrote in his seminal book that Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, you can still buy an original copy, like $800 or whatever, that attempted to separate risk from uncertainty. And a lot of people don't understand the difference. They say risk is uncertain, uncertainty is risk. Roughly speaking, risk is defined as quantifiable uncertainty, whereas uncertainty is unquantifiable risk. We're playing with words throughout this entire discussion, but I think if people listen to that and think about the difference between quantifiable uncertainty vis-a-vis uncertainty is unquantifiable risk, I think we're starting to understand, the difference between risk and uncertainty, right? How do we use strategic foresight?
I think it's important to recognize that the number of things that we have not thought of is vast, especially when you talk about a complex system. You referenced complex systems. When you think about second, third, fourth order effects, often we find that we have not even begun to ask the right questions yet, let alone anticipate or provide the correct answers. You mentioned Frank Knight. I'm obviously a huge fan of Frank Knight's work, and within uncertainty, Knight alluded to sort of a subcategory or an extension of it where there are possible futures that we can't assign probabilities to them, but perhaps we have not even considered them at all.
Yes.
And so these are what Donald Rumsfeld referred to as unknown unknowns. Richard Zeckhauser, who's a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, referred to them as states of ignorance. So instead of uncertainty, he referred to ignorance. I often am fond of quoting another economist, Thomas Schelling, who once wrote, the one thing that you cannot ask a person to do is make a list of things that they have not thought of. And I thought I read this the first time and I thought, well, this is either completely tautological or utterly profound, and I'm not entirely sure which it is. And so it was funny because I happened to be up at the Kennedy School, and I had the chance to meet with Richard Zeckhauser, who was a former colleague of Schelling's. And I was telling him about my work, and I was telling him about foresight, and I of course was trying to sound smart to Richard Zeckhauser, who's a brilliant man. And I said, well, Tom Schelling said, the one thing you can't ask a person to do is make a list of things they haven't thought of. And he just paused and looked at me and said, well, that's not true.
Interesting.
And I stopped and I thought about it for a second. And then, of course, I realized that, perhaps I ought to take a bit of my own medicine, because what we're doing when we do scenario exercises, when we do scenario planning, is we're precisely trying to reduce the size of what I've come to consider the Schelling zone, that list of things that we haven't thought of. And in part, to circle back to a point you were teasing at earlier, it's because we are doing this with other people in the room, people who have different sets of experiences, who come from different backgrounds, educational, national, different areas of domain expertise. Together, we think of things that we would not necessarily think of on our own. And so scenario planning is a very social process in many ways. And one of the benefits of that is it takes things that are in that unknown set, and it at least moves them into the kind of known unknowns. So we're moving a little bit along the spectrum, more toward what Knight would have characterized as risk, though we don't, ever quite get there.
And so I go back to a question that I wanted to ask, Peter, is how do we select the right people? If there's such a thing as right people, I'm using words that I'm not sure I fully express it. In other words, how do we, what quality are we looking for to give the optimum way of imagining?
I think in an ideal world, it is, a set of people who are open to the concept that imagination can provide something useful, that, they've already bought into the concept to some extent. At the same time, it's enormously valuable to take people who do not necessarily believe in the value of imagination, put them through an imaginative exercise, and to the extent that they realize something that they hadn't before, that they think of something they hadn't before, they pluck something out of the shelling zone and put it into the realm of at least the known unknown, where they can start to think about it. Now their mental model, not only about what the future could plausibly look like, has changed, but they've gained a dose of humility, which we talked about before,
Yes.
or epistemic humility, to put a fancy term on it. And I think that humility is absolutely essential when we consider the future, because it is almost guaranteed to be stranger than we expect. It is certain to surprise in some fashion. And so, there is no one right person to put in the room, but I do think that diversity is enormously important when it comes to scenario exercises, because people see different facets of the same problem. If you take that, quoting that undifferentiated mass of uncertainty, everybody sees a little bit of a different piece of it, and they can combine them in different ways. And it's through those recombinations that I think, in part, we come to new realizations.
Wonderful. And part of the privilege of taking your class was allowing us, I think, 2.5 days before we got into the exercise, or 3 days, I don't remember, where you have warmed us up. You have, done all the clay in your hand to make sure that we are softened, and we are ready to think in the way that we need. Without somebody like you, without the leadership, I think it's more challenging for just throw a group of people together and start imagining. I think must be a set of rules, is too strong a word, but a set of processes that we need to go through in order to set our mind in a state that can maximize or optimize the outcome that we're seeking. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. I think most concretely, I think facilitation is crucial to good scenario generation. More broadly, you're getting at a point that I think is very important. It's a bit of a paradox, where some constraints are actually liberating. So when we put some constraints on our imagination, it's not just, hey folks, sit at a table and imagine something new, because people will look at you with blank stares. But if you put some structure around the exercise, then they are better able to generate new ideas. And so, structure actually enables a sort of freedom, which sounds paradoxical and even Orwellian, and yet that's what happens.
So maybe the structure is a porous structure, but it's a structure.
That's right.
Well, you can go outside, but let's define something first, and then let your mind go beyond it if you need to. But at least a framework, I think, right?
Yes. So it's there's a social scientist who referred to it as liberating structures.
Yeah.
And that is what we are doing.
After our conversation, I'm going to go hit the books and get all the terms right. So one of the things that we haven't talked about, which I think is critically important, is if you can share a little bit about the two X's and how we think about, anything is possible, but let's put some, constraints, and picking those constraints is as important as picking the people and getting the people thinking in the right way. So can you talk a little bit about that and how we can be better able to find those, I call them constraints or what have you, those factors?
You are absolutely right that is one of the toughest parts of an exercise. And I should pause for a moment and say that there are many different ways to do scenario planning. And the way that we used at CSIS was the sort of what's known as the deductive approach to scenario planning, which results in the 2x2 matrix that many of your listeners are probably familiar with, where you sort of you cross these two variables. That gives you 4 different possible combinations, and then you fill them in each. But choosing what those axes are, choosing what those key uncertainties are, those driving forces of change is tricky. And what I like to look for are driving forces of change that we know that they are going to have an impact, but we are very uncertain as to what the nature of that impact will be. and then combining it with another one that is somewhat uncorrelated, that does not, necessarily, if X goes in one direction, Y does not always go in the same direction. It might go in a different way. And the reason we do that, choosing sort of uncorrelated, driving forces of change, is to give us a broader range of plausible futures. But I like to pick constraints, if you will, that not only are thought to have certainly have a high impact on the nature of the future, on the future operating environment, but they may not be the ones that we naturally think of when we're considering the question we're trying to address.
Right.
So, in considering the future, for example, of nuclear threats, a report I recently worked on looked at the role of climate change on geopolitical conflict. And not everybody who works on nuclear deterrence thinks about climate change all the time. In fact, I would venture that most of them don't. And yet, if we think about climate change having likely effect on geopolitical conflict and cooperation and the relative proportion of each, that's going to matter tremendously, especially given the nature of nuclear technology is dual use. It can be used for peaceful purposes, to generate energy, or for non-peaceful purposes and weapons. And so you're starting to get into the world already of things that you haven't thought of necessarily. And that's useful. The other thing is to think about those elements that are out of our control. So you referenced, all these different factors that are out of our control. Our strategy, whether as an individual, an organization, or a country, is really how do we interact with the players in our space that we can control, or have some influence over. I shouldn't say can control, but have some influence over, customer, supplier, what have you. When we're thinking about scenarios, we're looking at those factors that are really outside the bounds of our control. So the degree of geopolitical conflict, or macroeconomic indicators, or, environmental damage, or the severity of, weather events, things of that nature. Because we want to know, will our strategy survive in the face of the things that we don't have influence over? And that allows us to sort of pressure test the courses of action that we've chosen.
I'd like to give an example. Can you give us something so that people who are listening can say, "Oh, I see. This is what we meant by the two axes." Can you just cite an example so that we can sort of really quickly run around it and say, "Okay, here are the 4 quadrants."
So, yep, just to pluck an example out of, it was a private sector example, but generated for public good from the beginning of the pandemic, when Deloitte teamed up with Salesforce to generate, a range of futures, because it was fairly clear that the world was going to change, and that what it snapped back to would not necessarily be normal, as we thought of it in 2020, but would be something novel that we hadn't seen before. And so they simply looked at, and I say simple, I should put scare quotes around that, but at the time we did not know how severe the pandemic would be. So on one axis, they had severity of pandemic. And on the other axis, they had degree of international cooperation to stem the effects of the pandemic. And so in some ways, you wind up with a very nice rosy scenario where the pandemic is not severe and there's a lot of international cooperation to mitigate its effects. And of course, on the other side, you'd have, well, a raging pandemic and nobody's falling into line or cooperating at all or coordinating their actions. Of course, reality is that there are both good and bad in all of these scenarios. But one interesting thing to come out of it was, well, let's look at the rosy scenario. Well, those of us sitting in the United States are saying to our, probably looking at this matrix and saying to ourselves, well, in a rosy future where the pandemic's not that severe and there's high international cooperation, it'll be the United States leading the effort, or even if the pandemic is severe, but there's high international cooperation, the U.S. will be at the, at least the first among equals, and it'll, reestablish or help to establish the U.S. place in the world. The folks that wrote the scenario said, well, what if this actually affords an opportunity for China to take the lead? But, the United States doesn't necessarily have its house in order. The United States was not necessarily cooperating with itself in combating the pandemic during those years. And so there might be an opportunity for another nation to rise to the fore. And so that was one scenario that they considered in crossing those two different variables in that way.
Interesting. And I know you and I talked about this. I just tongue in cheek. I say, well, wouldn't it be interesting after we do that and we overlay a third axis to sort of talk about, okay, so you thought that these are the only ones. And what about if this happens, So it's endless possibility, but it is this endless possibility that excites our mind to test our mind and to test our imagination. And that more likely one of the scenario we have thought through, which brings me to a case that you mentioned, I think the first day of class, or you asked us to read about the Coast Guard. Can you share that a little bit?
Sure. In 1998, Admiral James Loy became the commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. And for the 200 plus years of its Coast Guard, of its history, the Coast Guard had not been a particularly strategic organization in the sense that it had not been forward-looking. It had not been particularly long-term in its vision. It was very responsive, reactive even. And that's in part because of its mandate, its missions. It has 11 different missions that are mandated by Congress. It's also called upon when hurricanes hit or oil rigs blow up to manage emergency response and so on and so forth. And so it was a very short-term focused, as I said, reactive organization. And Admiral Loy realized that had to change. If the Coast Guard was going to be prepared for the future, if it was, let's say, going to buy the ships that it needed, 20 years from now. And if you think about the tenses there, the ships it needed 20 years from now, how do you figure that out? And he said, well, we need a better process for it. And so they did pursue a scenario planning process to give themselves some strategic foresight. They looked at a number of different key uncertainties. In fact, 5. You mentioned adding 3. They did 5, but that would give you an unwieldy number of scenarios. So they wound up, in the various combinations they used, picking sort of the 5 that they found most interesting. And although scenarios are not meant to be predictive, it is sort of interesting when they do envision something that happens. One of them did, and this was in 1998-99, envisioned terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland, in a way that we had not experienced before. The Coast Guard then looked at those 5 scenarios that they came up with, and they said, well, what would we want to do to face any one of those? If any of them manifested, what would we want to have done? And they came up with 10, what they called robust strategies, which I alluded to earlier. And some of these were very straightforward. And you think they're even just completely obvious. Like, we ought to have a more flexible human resources system because we don't know what we're going to need in the future. And of course, that seems like very obvious, but do organizations always do the obvious thing? No, of course they don't. Sometimes it needs to be surfaced and socialized. And a number of the things that this exercise did surface and socialize in the Coast Guard, one of them was we ought to have a single commander in charge of every port. So the Coast Guard is responsible for U.S. ports. As of 1998, in most U.S. ports, there were 3 captains, 3 06 level officers responsible for running each port. So if something happened, there had to be coordination among 3 people. In an emergency, that's not exactly what you want to have happen. There was also a lack of what they call maritime domain awareness, whereas, you think of an air traffic controller knowing what planes are in the air at any given moment, you would think that we would have the equivalent for the water. We did not. So they said, they came up with these 10 strategies. They said we ought to pursue all these things. They put it in a nice glossy report. They published it, and then they put it on a shelf, which is often what happens, in organizations and certainly in government. And then, a couple years later, 9/11 hit. And the Coast Guard was responsible for helping several 100,000 people who were stranded on the southern tip of Manhattan get off of the island. And in the wake of 9/11, they pulled the report off the shelf and said, would we have been in a better position had we done the things we said we should do? And they realized that yes, they would have. New York was actually one of the very few ports in the United States that did have a single captain in charge of the port, and one imagines that helped coordinate response at the time. And following 9/11, the Coast Guard was able to put into effect some of those strategies. It actually was President Bush gave the Coast Guard a Coast Guard officer who had been in charge of this project the lead in developing the maritime domain awareness strategy for the United States. And so what you could see is that they had managed to do, this is an unwieldy phrase, but some sort of, cognitive advance work, some thinking ahead of time, so that when the thing happened that nobody wanted to have happen, they weren't caught like the deer in the headlights. They had actually done the thinking ahead of time that enabled them to move forward more quickly, more adroitly, and it served them enormously well.
I really love that idea because it goes back to our one of our statement that if we have never experienced it, how do we do it? Well, we obviously never experienced a homeland issue like 9/11, but they still thought about it. It's through this imagination, the plausible or even the possible. So it's very powerful. It's powerful only when it happens because look, this is not the first time I thought about it. It's not virgin territory. I've done this. I know we're running out of time. One thing I do want to ask is about decision making, and I understand that you are in the process of writing a book on good decisions, and how they come about. We have all kinds of biases, and decision making is fascinating. We can go into this whole yesterday me, today me, and tomorrow me. But more importantly is when we bring people in together to do this type of planning, we all carry our own biases. We all carry our own blind spots. So it's not only the part that we're talking about imagination. Let's say we are not blind to imagining. Oh, great. After 2 stiff drinks, everybody kind of say, yeah, I can imagine, right? I'm teasing, but that idea that I can let my mind go a little bit more relaxed and relax the boundaries and think about what's possible. But when it comes to discussion, when it comes to debating the scenarios that could happen or can be imagined, we are still subject to those biases, our framework. And that part, I think, is almost ingrained. It's really hard for us to unwind that. Can you talk a little bit how important, the confirmation bias or all the other, overconfidence bias, there's so many biases. How do we try to shed those biases when we have this conversation after we did the grid of the 4 possible scenarios and we start debating or discussing them? That's where biases really come through really quickly. And how do we minimize that? What do we need to say? And what are some of the things that you had worked for you, or do you don't feel that's as relevant?
I think it's absolutely relevant, and we could certainly have a very engaged and lengthy conversation about it. I will say the thing that I have found most useful in combating biases, both in the sort of Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman sense, and just in the more general sense of, clinging tightly to one's own beliefs, which is not necessarily a bias exactly, but it's a tendency that we all have, and it's not necessarily a healthy one, is to ask yourself the question, what would convince me that I might be wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about that is that instead of going out and looking for information that confirms our existing beliefs, it encourages us to go out and look for information that might disconfirm our existing beliefs. And it lets us set the standard for what that might be. So it's not particularly threatening. It's not, accusing someone else of being wrong. It's focusing, frankly, on oneself and saying, well, what would make me think differently? What would adjust my opinion? What would force me to update my beliefs? And then go look for that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find it, that's fascinating because you've gained a tremendous amount of information. You've updated your beliefs. And so the diagnostic value of that bit of information is really high. So that's my, in a nutshell, that's kind of like my one best trick.
So Berkshire Hathaway apparently, that's my understanding, I've never been to any one of the annual shareholder meeting. They invite short sellers. They invite the people who feel that stock is going to crash because they want to know what information or what factors cause these short sellers to short the stock, which is to your point, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But it starts with having the confidence that it's okay you don't know everything. It's all right. And that we're going to benefit from this. So I will end our conversation by saying perhaps the next time if I have the privilege of even participating in one of your sessions or anybody's sessions on foresight, global foresight or otherwise, is to say, instead of just checking your phone, your guns, and everything else outside, check your pride.
Mm-hmm.
Let us be open for the benefit of the group. That's why we're here. And I think setting the standard by a facilitator like you, who we all look to guide us for something that's bigger than each one of us, I think set the right tone to the attitude of getting the maximum out of imagination in foresight. I hope you agree with that.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that. I think there is profound strength in humility.
Yes.
But that is not always the way that people approach problems. But it's very valuable.
Yes. Well, Peter, I can't thank you enough. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've learned every time I talk with you. So I really appreciate your ability to explain and to answer my questions, because I'm the biggest beneficiary. So thank you very much, Peter, for spending time with us and sharing your insight to your foresight. So to speak.
It was really my pleasure, Philip. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
You can always find more episodes by visiting philipchao.us/podcast or find us on your favorite podcast app. You can always leave us feedback, ask questions, or request a topic for us to discuss by sending an email to pc@philipchao.us.
Views expressed in the Tao of Chao podcast are individual opinions, and they do not represent the employers of each guest or the firm each guest is associated. Our podcasts are for educational and informational purposes only and should not be deemed or viewed as investment advice or recommendations. Please consult your personal financial advisor, investment expert, or investment fiduciary before taking any actions about your plan and investments.